The scripture reading is Exodus chapter 3, verse 2 through 6. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God.
You can be seated. Thank you. Good morning, church family, and good morning to our guests as well. I'm glad that everybody is here this morning, that we get to be together and worship God together. What a gift. What a blessing. I hope that you got a family report as you were coming in this morning. There is a place on the back page to take notes with this message. There's some pertinent information to our church family on page 2. There's all sorts of good things in there. So if you didn't get one of those and you want one, you can raise a hand. And Jason's got a few right here in the center aisle that he can pass out to help us all to stay quite literally on the same page with that. Pun intended. Lame as it was, pun intended. There you go. I want to remind you of a couple of things, point out a couple of things out of that and related to just kind of housekeeping stuff with who we are as a church family. The first is, Jim talked about his Aunt Mary and her singing and how nice it is to sing hymns and sing praise to God. This afternoon up in Aurora, there is an opportunity for you to do some more singing with brothers and sisters from all over the Front Range. And so if you want to go to that, you want to carpool, let me know. We'll see what we can work out for you, help you get up there. But that's at 4 o'clock this afternoon at the Smoky Hill Church. It's going to be an area-wide song service. So there's info on that on page 2 in the family report as well. I say that about it being brothers and sisters from all over the Front Range, but the last one that we were at, I found myself sitting in the row right behind somebody from my dinky little hillbilly town in Tennessee. So you just never know who's going to be there. It was a pretty awesome opportunity to be with some brothers and sisters and be able to sing. So hopefully you can make some plans to be there this afternoon for that. Derek and I both have been asked to lead singing, and so that's a nice privilege, which would be really cool to be able to do that. And then the other thing that I wanted to point out is, I believe the first announcement at the top of page 2, which is the passing of Valerie Bailey and Maureen Taylor's brother, Dennis. Dennis was a good man. He was a pretty special guy, quiet, reserved, but such a spark of joy about him and about just the daily things of life. Thinking about music makes me think of him too, and the extra singing that's going on today. And so anyway, I just want to point that out and be the one to say publicly, let's be especially compassionate and sympathetic toward them, and then also toward 3 of Dennis's nieces and nephews that are part of our church family, my wife Caitlin, and then Emily Velez and Eric Bailey as well. So just keep the whole family in your prayers, if you will, and especially show some sympathy there, some genuine sympathy toward Val and Maureen. All right. I think that's what I wanted to talk about before we get to the message this morning. Let's go ahead and do that now. The 10 Commandments are God's first revelation of His will to an entire nation of people, and they are, to my mind, still the finest example of a moral national law that has ever been given. Let me start this morning with a question for you to ponder. Thinking back through human history, what is the greatest contribution that past generations have made to today? Now, you come up with your own answers, and if you happen to end up at lunch today with the history professor who's sitting right over there, then maybe you can have a debate about what that actually is, but just think about it. What are the greatest contributions that past generations have made to today, rather? I think that's kind of a hard thing to think about, because your mind might start going to like different technological advances, or to some time period where there was a huge leap forward in the arts in some way, or maybe a great book or a great leader for others to emulate, or maybe it's some sort of medical advancement that 2 generations ago, 3 generations ago, they gave us that and it has saved countless lives since then. Maybe it's that kind of thing that you think about as the greatest contribution they made to how we live today. But here's the question that I really want you thinking about. What about the ethics of past generations? What about the things that they saw as important ideals? Have they contributed positively to the ideals of today? Do you think that those of us who are living today have been mostly benefited or mostly damaged by the ethics that previous generations have handed down to us? Now, here's the reason I'm asking that question. I think it's fashionable in our time to look back at history and say, boy, weren't they backwards? Weren't they just so primitive? Weren't they just so pathetic that they thought those were good ideals to live by? I've shared this quote before, I think from this pulpit, though I'm not 100% sure, but it's from historian and sociologist Lewis Mumford, who says that every generation rejects their fathers and makes friends with their grandfathers. Now that's an interesting way to look at history, isn't it? That the generation right before us, we look at them and we go, oh my goodness, look at all the things they got wrong. Let's go back a generation before them. They were good people. But now we live in an era where I think Mumford would be even wrong about that so often what's taught is regardless of the setting, so often what we're taught is to reject what we've been handed from previous generations, whether it's the one previous or the 2 or 3 or 10, and to forge our own path, to find what we believe is right, to find what matters to us and push that forward. And all of that kind of makes me wonder about the 5th of the 10 Commandments, which we're going to talk about today. In both places where the 10 Commandments are given, the 5th says, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Now this commandment, this word, like the other 9, has some powerful implications because it was given to God's people as a whole nation. And obviously it has some implications for how we live as individuals, but we have to think on the grand scale because God gave this as a national law, not just a personal one. When he talked to an entire nation of people, I think this command has some echoes for how we think about that opening question. What about the ethics that have been taught to us by previous generations? I want us to think kind of in that channel today as we study and we discuss the 5th of the 10 Commandments, continuing in our series on this. I want to talk about how we can keep this principle because it is directly quoted in the New Testament by the Apostle Paul as something that we are meant to keep going forward as an ideal, as a principle, always active among the people of God. So I want to talk about it. I want to talk about how we honor our father and mother and those that we would call our fathers in previous generations as well. But before I do that, I always feel compelled, when I'm talking about parenting and I'm talking about generations, I always feel compelled to make the small caveat that I know there are situations in families that are outside the norm, and I totally respect the fact that not everybody will have the biblical wherewithal to keep the ideals as I'm going to talk about them today. There are times and there are exceptions to some of these rules, but I am very quick to get back to the main point here, that the exceptions do not unravel the rule. And we need to have the biblical wisdom to know the difference between the two. I'm going to trust you to do that if you are one of those exception cases today. I'm going to trust you to handle that with biblical wisdom. But what I want to do today is talk about the rule that this command presents for God's people in all of time when it says, honor your father and your mother. So we're going to do this in 3 ways. We're going to talk about the 5th command for kids, we're going to talk about the 5th command for adults, and then we're going to talk about the 5th command for God's kingdom. So that's what we're doing as we go through these today. So first, kiddos, that would be anybody age 3 through still living at home. Please pay attention, okay? Kiddos, let me talk about this commandment for you. By the way, that does include my kids. I won't call you by name, but you better listen, boys. All right. The disadvantages of being the preacher's kid. There are a few. Sorry about that, boys. This commandment does still stand for those living at home under the rule and authority of parents. This is the way God wants families to behave. That kids honor their parents and that kids obey their parents. The command is repeated in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 1. The Apostle Paul said in Ephesians chapter 6, he actually wrote a small passage that is directed to small children, young children in a congregation, and it says, "Obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother." The first commandment given with a promise. Here's the promise. "So that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land that God is giving you." Now, kiddos, I'm not going to over-explain anything to you guys. You're smart, okay? So let me just ask, and you mouth it to me without saying it out loud. If the Bible says you should obey your parents, what should you do? Yes, thank you very much. Okay. He was very clear with his mouth movements too, so I know he got it. Okay. Now, when, again, mouth it to me without saying it, when does God say that's a good idea? Yeah, he doesn't, which means it's always. When is it a good idea to obey your parents? Always. And that's the thing. God does not give this commandment a when. He gives it a always. And so when they tell you a chore to do, when they tell you a place not to go, when they tell you how to treat one of your siblings, when they tell you it's time to eat your vegetables, when they tell you that it's time for worship or Bible reading or prayer, when they teach you to finish what you start, when they push you to be the best that you can be in everything you do, God's will is that you obey your parents. Now, again, the same age bracket. Anybody age 3 to still living at home? Let me ask you a question. Raise your hand if you knew that. You can actually raise your hand. Raise your hand if you knew you were supposed to obey your parents. Yeah, good. Keep it up if you always do it. Good. No, in all seriousness, kiddos, thank you for being honest and not funny today, because I appreciate that. That, I think, is what we have to learn from this. The Apostle Paul said, "Obey your parents, for this is right." It's the right thing to do. And how often does the preacher reserve a huge portion of the sermon for this age bracket? Not very often, guys, but this has to be said. Because this was in God's top 10 when he gave his laws for the nation of Israel. It's not something that he gave as a suggestion. It's not something that he said, you do this if it feels right. It's something that is a full-fledged command for everybody, every age, including kids still under mom and dad's roof. And so, I think the Lord gives us credit for understanding that relationship changes over time. We sort of mark it by the move-out date, that's a passage into adulthood. They move out and the rules sort of change about that, and there's wisdom in the Proverbs to discuss that. But just talking about how important it is that while we're still at mom and dad's house, while we're still with them, God said, "Children, obey your parents." And that's the way that they are to be honored. In the early stages of the relationship between parents and children, they are to be honored by obedience. Now, as I said, the Bible gives us credit, and we could go into a long side discussion about how the Bible gives us credit for believing and for knowing that relationship will eventually change. It's not always one of just those in charge and those who are, obedient to those in charge. It's not always that. And that's where we get to the idea of honor and how we get to talking about this command for adults as well. Whatever your age, there is a command here for you regarding your parents as well. Now, again, I always try to say this. I know that this sort of thing can prove painful to talk about for some, and I genuinely apologize for that. I also know there are some exceptions to these rules. But again, the exceptions don't change the rule. What they ought to do is just remind us that we live in a broken world where we need Jesus more than anything else. So that being said, though, if we live in an ideal world, and as much of an ideal world as we, the people who are faithful to God, can create around us, these concepts that we're about to talk about ought to be governing ideals in that. Because the concept of honor in this command is something that I think the vast majority of people are able to do if we have the spiritual wherewithal to do it. Honor your father and your mother. Whether your parents are Christians or they are rebellious, degenerate unbelievers, whether your parents are still part of your life or there is some sort of irreconcilable distance between you, whether they're living or they're already in their eternal destiny, there is something I hope that all of us can understand about this concept of honoring your father and your mother. And so here are just 3 pieces of advice from me on how to do that. Number one, honor any good that you can see in their way of living. Even if they were unbelievers and you're a devout believer, do whatever you can to honor whatever from their life aligns with God's own goodness. If you can find something in there that parallels His goodness, honor that about your father and your mother. And doing that, I would say, secondly, honor their ethics, especially if you were blessed to have good people as your parents, especially if you were blessed to have Christian people as your parents. And so again, I think we need to take into account the way that our preceding generations have brought us to where we are today. Even if you don't end up living your life exactly the same way that the ethics of your parents' generation would have dictated, at the very least, I think we can see, especially in those who are Christians, that there is goodness to be honored and respected in that generation. You see this really clearly, by the way, in the way that God talks about Israel's kings throughout their history. What is the one qualification that's given again and again and again for whether a king is good or bad? He did evil or he did good in the eyes of God. But who are they always compared to when they do well spiritually? He always either walked or didn't walk in the ways of David, his father. Now, that says so much about David, but I think what it also says is there is a generational aspect to our faith. That there's something that we look back to, and if we can see in a previous generation, no matter how far back that generation may be, if we can see something good in that we can honor, then we should. Again, specific examples from these kings. Think about kings like Jehoshaphat. Think about kings like Hezekiah, kings like Josiah. Those 3 men are compared to David, and their reign did not look exactly like David's. But the ethics, the principles, the underlying guiding ideals, those echo what was important to David. When David did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, they followed that. And it honored David because it honored God who had sought to live, it honored God who had blessed David. Now, how do we do that in our own lives? Let me give you a couple of specific pieces of advice here. One mostly for me, but hopefully it will be good for you as well. I'm certainly the kind of person that on occasion in my life, I have made a decision that I made specifically because I knew my dad would not have made that decision. Any of y'all ever done that? There have been times where I did something specifically to be different than my folks and then a previous generation before me. I didn't ask whether it was a good idea or not. I just asked, was it different than them? Does that honor our father and our mother? No, it really doesn't. Now, to ask and really think it through and say, did they do well? Then I'll do that. Did they do poorly? Then I won't do that. I'll do better. But to just do it out of spite for a previous generation, just to rebel against their ideas, that doesn't speak well of me, and I know that. And I'm trying to repent of that. I'm trying to do better than that, because that's not what we're called to as God's people. We're not called to just break the paradigms that the generations before us gave. We're called to look at everything through the filter of godly wisdom. And if we see in that previous generation some godly wisdom, then we'll honor that by trying to pull it forward into our lives and our thinking and our words and our relationships as well. There's no honor in behaving like I do sometimes. And I know that, and I'm trying to fix it. But I'm hoping that by telling you that, it warns you not to do the same. Now, on the more positive side of that, let me take just a second and give you some of the principles that I have tried and will continue to try to live by in my life, because I have learned them from my own parents and from my wife's parents. Here are some of the principles that I have tried and will continue to try to emulate from them. Diligence on the job, constant self-improvement, generosity toward other people, the value and the joy found in reading God's Word, consistency all the way, thankfulness for everything, giving time to your children as the greatest gift, and the importance of overcoming challenges rather than avoiding them. Those are my list of whatever that was, 8 things right there. That as I look at the generation before me and I try to honor my father and my mother and my father-in-law and mother-in-law, those are the ideals that I try to emulate, because I see those principles at work in them, and I see the good and the goodness of God through that. Now, maybe as you think back over the lives of your parents, you can see some of those same principles and some others as well at work in them. And my hope is that we learn from this ideal in the 5th commandment to make our faith a multi-generational thing. That we make it the kind of thing that we can recollect some great principles from our parents' lives, our grandparents, and our great 1,000 greats grandparents. Because we want to understand what pleases God. And if there's anybody in that line that can show us that, then let's imitate what they showed us. Because it's an attempt to glorify and please God. Now, secondly, second main idea here, I guess third main idea in this section. The command to honor your father and mother also means that we need to be willing to care for our father and mother in each generation. We do have a commitment to care for our parents in their old age. It's a display of that idea of honor. And this is where the commandment really starts to shine in the realm of a national law. When you connect this commandment to all the provisions made in the law of Moses for orphans and for sojourners and for slaves and for widows, it becomes really apparent how God wanted this command to honor your father and mother to have a societal impact. God was creating a really good society for his people by teaching them to care for those who were less fortunate than them. Now, we talked about this a little bit last week when we talked about the Sabbath command, that in the land of Israel, everybody, even the livestock and even the slaves, got a day of rest on the Sabbath day. And that by itself is God showing that he cares about every single person. How much more then when we have a command that says, honor your father and mother, not just obey them, but honor them, do we see God providing for those who have a need? The command to honor our parents naturally means that we will care for them in their old age and the weakness that is bound to come with that. Listen, I dread the thought of any society where people who are quote unquote low on the totem pole are being mistreated or devalued. I dread the thought of that kind of society because the 20th century showed us all over both hemispheres what that can do, okay? I don't want us to live in that kind of society, and clearly God doesn't want that either. What he sees when he looks at all of his people, no matter what class level or what contribution they make to society or what level of vitality they may still have or not have, God sees every single person made in his own image. And if he respects and honors that, then we ought to treat people, every single person, with the same kind of dignity that they really deserve. And so that means that we care for our parents. Now, is that always going to look the same in every single case? No, it's not. And anybody who tells you differently is probably selling something, to quote Princess Bride, okay? It's not. It's not going to look the same in every single case. There are different types of arrangements talked about even in the scriptures as people took care of their elderly and aging parents into life's later years and up until they passed from this life. One of them, by the way, King David, had a full-time nurse. There's in-home health care right there in the Bible, 1 Kings chapter 1. It's a little odd, I admit, but it's there, okay? So that's just showing you there are a handful of different options for this, but the point is, at the bottom line of all of them, that God's people care for their parents in old age because it's a way that we honor them. There's this really convicting passage in Matthew chapter 15 when Jesus is pretty riled up at the religious leaders, like we talked about in the communion talk. He's pretty riled up at the religious leaders because they have created this elaborate theological system where they don't believe that God requires them to take care of their parents in old age. Because they've said, well, whatever money I would have used to take care of you, now I'm just giving it to God, and so I don't have to take care of you. I'm relieved of that responsibility. How does Jesus respond to that? You hypocrites. Ouch. Just for not taking care of your parents? What do you mean, just for not taking care of your parents? Yes, because the fifth commandment that they had had for thousands of years told them, honor your father and mother. Don't come up with some other system where you think I can get out of that and God will be pleased more with the new idea I came up with. He said, honor them. And Jesus looks at them not taking care of their folks in old age and he says, that is not honoring them. And so, I know that we make jokes about this in our society and we say, parents, be nice to your kids because they pick your nursing home. I get it. But let's just be honest that this is one of those areas where God's people are going to look pretty different from the rest of the world a lot of the time. Because we are going to be choosing how to care for our older parents. And we need to do that in a way that honors them, shows them dignity, and shows them how much we care. We will continue to speak kindly, brothers and sisters, about our parents, and when we talk about them with our friends and our colleagues, we need to do that because it honors them. We need to be people that when we pursue a care option, we choose what's in their best interest, not just our own. And we need to be people, I know this is simple, but it needs to be said once in a while, who pray for our parents, who pray for their health and for their mental well-being and for their spiritual well-being. They've prayed for our spiritual well-being. If they were faithful to God, then we ought to do the same for them. For the Christian, obeying the Word of God means honoring our parents, and that means caring for them, whatever form that needs to take. Now, that's for kids and for adults. Let's talk about this commandment very quickly and its value for society, for God's kingdom. This commandment is unique among the 10 because it actually gives the reason for obeying it. This commandment tells us, you honor your father and your mother so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Now, how's that going to work? Well, for Israel, it meant if they had kept this command and the others that God made for them as well, then they would spend a long time living in the land of Canaan. He did make that contingent for them. I know we love to talk about unconditional grace, and there's some truth to that, but this is contingent for them. God promised them, if you'll keep the covenant with me, I'll keep the land clear for you and safe and secure. And they didn't. But he said it clearly in this command, that if you do this, you'll live a long time in the land that God is giving you. But then for us, this command still has a promise. And again, Paul echoes this, that if we can keep this command, then we will continue to live a long time as a generational faith is continually perpetuated through the people of God. Now, each of us, are we going to get longer lives out of that? No, that's not the promise. But the promise is that those who live in God's presence and with Him, if they continue to pass that on and they honor the previous generations, then they will continue with God in all of His blessings. And I want to point out, there's an important historical side of this that shows us just how serious God is about this commandment. The Ten Commandments are given twice. One is in Exodus 20, the other's in Deuteronomy chapter 5. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, when Moses says this particular commandment, to honor your father and mother, they're about to leave their fathers and mothers for the very last time. Because you remember, only the younger generation is going into the land of Canaan across the Jordan River. The older generation are the ones that history will forever know as the unfaithful ones who were kept out of the land, who died in the wilderness. And so as you have these two groups standing on the banks of the Jordan, one group is going into the land, and the other group, because of their spiritual failure, is going to be left out in the wilderness. And God says to the group going in the land, honor the other group. You show honor to your father and your mother, even after you won't see them anymore. Even after you have walked away from each other because of their spiritual failures. That to me puts an extra emphasis on this particular command. That it's going to be difficult at times, and yet God still asks it of us. Can we muster the faith, just a mustard seed worth of faith, to do what He says in honoring them? Because for Israel, if they had done this, they would have lived a long time in the land of Canaan. And for us, we will keep the faith in God alive for a long time if we will honor this command. And I think the other benefit of that is that it just reminds us how heavy the responsibility of parenting really is. Mickey mentioned that in his prayer just before I got up here, and I appreciate that. There is something extremely sobering about knowing that you're raising small adults, about knowing that when they're small, you're molding them into the kind of person that they're going to become. And to me, the most compelling and the most humbling aspect of that is that children learn their first lessons about God from their earthly fathers. They learn their first lessons, not their ultimate ones. That comes from the Word. But they learn their first lessons about God from their earthly fathers. I love that song that Rusty led. I've only sung it maybe twice in my whole life before today. The one that says, "Father, help us raise our children." No, did you cry on the last verse? Yeah, me neither, not at all. There's just something really, really powerful about realizing that what we are going to need the strength of God to do this right, because we bear such a heavy responsibility. Now, admittedly, we're talking in kind of two different directions here, right? So parenting, we're trying to teach the children about God, and in this command from the Ten Commandments, we're trying to get everybody to think through the generational line the other way. You honor the generations before you. But both show us how heavy the relationship really is. Because if we can learn to honor our moms and dads, then we're well on the right track to honoring God. Are our parents going to disappoint us sometimes? Yes. Are they going to do the right thing for us, but in a way that we don't really like and appreciate sometimes? Yes. Yeah. Are they going to ask more of us at times than we really wanted to give? Yes. can we honor them in all of those things? Because, brothers and sisters, God's going to do those same things for us. He's going to disappoint us at times. Not because He's wrong, but because we had the wrong expectations. We'll feel disappointment with Him. He's going to sometimes ask more of us than what we're really wanting to give and what we're comfortable giving. He's going to sometimes do the right thing for us, but in a way that we don't really appreciate and like. And yet, if we can learn to honor mom and dad when those things happen, then we're getting some really good practice for honoring God when those things inevitably happen. And so the reality is that it begins at home. And in smack dab in the middle of the Ten Commandments, we are told the importance of our home relationships and how they bring us to know God and all the blessings that can happen if we truly value and respect those relationships as we should. Honor your father and your mother as the Lord your God commanded you, that your days may be long and that it may go well with you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. In succeeding generations, the level of acceptance of this truth goes up and down. I know that. Sometimes society agrees with the Bible and it teaches children in every generation to respect the generation before. But sometimes society goes a very different direction from the Bible. And sometimes parents don't deserve their children's respect. And sometimes children grow into adulthood before they repudiate the ideas of their parents. And sometimes other entities try and get between parents and children and stop the honor and the teaching and just break all of that up. I understand there are all sorts of things that can be risks to how this works well. But at the end of the day, we have still got to be committed as we possibly can to the importance of family, and to the importance of teaching our children, and to the importance of honoring our fathers and our mothers, so that we may live long, maybe even eternally, and the promised rest that God will give to us when this life is over. If there's somebody among us today that has a spiritual need that you want to make known in a public way, you can come and you can talk to me or to one of the elders about that, and we'll open the Bible. We'll show you what God says are the next steps you need to take in order to follow Him and to be His. And so if we can help you with that and you want to let it be known, why don't you come forward while we stand and sing.